The guy that Lawrence of Arabia. Yep. Lawrence of Arabia said there's two kinds of Arabs. There's the Arab of the desert, and there's an Arab of the city. And the Arab of the city does not have the smile or the peace of mind and the friendliness and hospitality as the Arab of the desert. And I found out later that Vincent Hall kind of had Lewis of Arabia, Lawrence of Arabia's attitude when it came to Jamaica. He appreciated the farm people in the mountains. And he'd rather have everything going on in the mountains where the people were hospitable and friendly and conservative and people of the earth, people of the land. When you go into the city of Kingston, you got the hustle and the bustle, the streetcars and the elbowing and the shouts of the marketplace. And he says the smile isn't there anymore. And so you had two Jamaicas, the Jamaica of the country, the Jamaica of the city. Just like you got two Floridas. You got the Florida of tourism, and then you got Fort Meade and Arcadia and Bartow and our small towns here, and even Winter Haven is becoming a bigger city, but you still have, when you get into the big city, it's not the same as the small town. And that's what discovered. Here we did the record. From the records I found, some said he was a British officer stationed in Jamaica. And that's all I read in our history book and found out it's absolutely wrong. He was not a British officer. He was enrolled in the military as a private in Texas, and then he boated out there. He was at the Cambrai offensive and fought in the trenches there in particular. He went in as a mechanic. And here we have these particular freedom trucks that were brought about with our war with Mexico. And the war with Mexico taught our military to say you can move munitions and supplies quicker by truck than you can by mule. And so that was the beginnings of using truck to modify and enhance warfare. Here you have the old mule train, and that's 1917. Now if he's born in 1882, 18 and 17, the man was about 34, 35 years old at this time. November 20, 1917, there were 400 British tanks supported by infantry under the command of General Julian Byng, and they moved forward into the German lines. In 2 weeks there were 50,000 German casualties and 45,000 British casualties. Hall was gassed and had to wear knee braces later on due to his injuries. He couldn't go bowling, didn't do sports, couldn't play cricket because he had to live with leg braces. Found this out later. Interesting thing, I remember there was a helicopter shot down, and one lady was pining because her son was on the helicopter. I don't know if there's 11 special forces killed or 18 killed in that particular, and she said, well, these guys, they didn't have proper training, the pilot was properly trained, and the helicopter wasn't the right kind of helicopter for that particular foray, and she was sad because she was a hurt mother because her son died. And I'm thinking about, here is a modern mother who lost a son in one of our forays in Desert Storm. And here we have a death casualty of about 11 to 18 people. In 2 weeks' time, 95,000 casualties. They said this was the war to end all wars. And we have a record of Lieutenant Hall as chaplain, where young men would be blasted to smithereens, and their head would be in their lap, his lap, and they'd be crying out for their mother, and he'd pretend to be their mother for that time, so they'd die with a little bit of peace and comfort. Whenever he reported at the end of this Cambrai offensive, and they pushed the Germans back 7 miles. The church bells of England rang because of the victory. 6 months later, the Germans were back in the same trenches they started from, because they didn't follow it up like they should have at the time. But at the time, he was a private. Private Hall, where's your corporal? He's dead, sir. Private Hall, where's your sergeant? He's dead, sir. Private Hall, where's your lieutenant? He's got both his legs blown off. He's over in the hospital tent, sir. Well, Lieutenant Hall, carry on. That's how quickly you got promoted when you had this many casualties in 2 weeks' time. And this was life in the military. This was, Hall would talk about the Australian mounted troops, and some of his stories he wrote for the Jamaica Gleaner, he talked about the mounted infantry. They'd ride horseback, dismount, fire the weapons. They'd get back on their horses, they'd ride to the next place, dismount, fire their weapons. And they didn't shoot from the horses like the Huns and the Mongols did, but they would ride to wherever they're going to do battle and go on from there. And of course, he being down in Australia, a lot of stories are told about how he was not only a preacher for the Methodist Church in Australia, he was also like a Crocodile Dundee. He was a great lecturer on flora and fauna of Australia. And he knew more about Australia than most Australians did. He circumvented the continent. He crossed the continent. I found a record of him flying a biplane later on over Australia. So he was quite an individual. Here's the Australian mounted up in Tripoli before they went down into Israel. And he was there in Israel under the leadership of Allenby. This was the light horseman of the mounted division riding through the streets of Damascus. Here's the British West Indies Regiment. We had, I think, about 35,000 Jamaicans that served in Israel, Palestine, during World War I. And there's about 10 or 11 World War I memorials all over Jamaica. And one of the fellows, I think it was Manley, that wore a black tie in commemoration of his uncle who died in World War I. And so, but the Jamaicans were badly treated by the British. We've got some tales of them going to Canada with cotton clothing, and they say, well, the wool blankets are for the British troops, not you Jamaicans. So many, thousands, froze to death because of the color of their skin. Unfortunate. World War II, a guy said, I want to go fight. So he had to sell his instrument and his bicycle to get ship fare to get over to England. And he was flying, and after the war, he got done flying. He says, you Jamaicans go back where you came from. We don't want you around here. This was after World War II. So in some ways, you know, when Jamaica asked for its freedom in 1962, Britain says, go ahead and take your liberty. And so there are some stories that can be told we're not going to go into. This is Lord Allenby. He was the Dwight Eisenhower of World War I. He was the commander of all the British forces and the American forces and the French forces that were in that took Israel. And this was leading up to right before Israel's statehood, where it became a democracy soon after. But here Jerusalem is rescued by the British after 673 years of Muslim rule, and this was the end of the Ottoman Empire at that particular time. Now here we have Allenby in his conquest of Jerusalem. He refused to ride through the gates on a white horse. He said the only one, he's being a religious man, he says the only one who's going to ride a white horse through the gates of Jerusalem is Jesus Christ when he comes again. So he refused to take that privilege. Now, Vincent Hall's connection with, here's Allenby, shows how a moral man conquers Jerusalem. He walked through the gate. He didn't ride through the gate on a white horse. He showed you that. It's almost like whenever MacArthur decided to have short sleeves and not all the regalia of a general, and when he accepted the defeat and the signing the papers at the end of World War II. Now, Vincent Hall was the chaplain to Allenby, and Allenby says, Lieutenant Hall, I want you to address the British troops at Nazareth. I want you to address the British troops at Alexandria, Egypt, to tell them the importance of winning Israel back from the empire they were in to the Western mind and Western fellowship. And so he was the chaplain that spoke at this particular time. Again, we find Allenby there at the tomb of Tut, and they gave him special. Lord Carnarvon and Howard Carter gave him special. And here again, Vincent Hall runs into his old general friend. They called him Field Marshal Allenby. And today they got an Allenby Bridge named after him between Jerusalem and into Jordan. Now this is Memorial Day, 1917. Here we have Vincent Hall. In this particular picture, this is where, see if I got the right picture here. This is Vincent Hall on the Sea of Galilee near Tiberias, and here is Mount Zion in Jerusalem. And Vincent Hall had gotten away from his faith, and at this place in Galilee, he fell down on his knees and said, God, I want to repent of my wayward life, I want to return to Jamaica and preach the gospel if I so live, and I will preach it till my death. And this was a promise he made on the Sea of Galilee right after or during World War I and this particular situation. This is the Valley of Kings. This is more of a modern shot. In the Reader's Digest, we can see some of the earlier shots of this particular Valley of Kings. Here's some of the dig crew of that particular area doing some of the dig in that particular area. And it seems like adults always get, and rich people always get the credit for finding things. Actually, it was a kid. He was putting the water jugs down the sand, he hit something solid, and he brushed it away, and he found a step, and he said, "Mr. Cotter, Mr. Cotter, Mr. Cotter, Mr. Cotter," and they ran up there and they found the steps leading down to the tomb of Tut. It's like these two shepherd boys out in Israel. They're tossing rocks at a cave, and they heard the clank and clatter of broken pottery. And they found the Dead Sea Scrolls. And it seems like in archaeology today, we wonder how important are the Dead Sea Scrolls, how important are the discovery of Tut's tomb. And Tut was a kind of a minor pharaoh. But ever since, they always compare all archaeological finds to, oh, was it as good as Tut's tomb? Does it measure up to Tut's tomb? Was it as good as, or was half, 1/3, 1/10? Everything, it was the, Tut's tomb is the primo, it's the Harvard College, the non-accredited college that all the colleges that are accredited live up to. It's the Harvard College of Archaeology. And the same thing with the Dead Sea Scrolls. They look at that particular find as the apex of the Harvard College in the apex of discovery. And all other discoveries are compared to those discoveries. And who are the heroes? Kids tossing stones, kids fetching water for the work crew. Isn't that ironic? Here's one of the cook tents and some of the dig sites on the archaeological site here. And this, the year is going in around 1923, I'm believing. Here is this is C. Vincent Hall. This interesting thing is in Mr. Hall, right here it says the lecture, C. Vincent Hall, pointing to the tomb of Tutankhamun in the Valley of the Kings. And here he is, right here. And he's wearing one of these Jungle Jim safari hats. You know, we could put on an Indiana Jones hat, but he didn't wear the Indiana Jones hat. He usually wore one of those old Jungle Jim safari hats. And that was C. Vincent Hall. The interesting thing, too, is in our going after the thing, here's the lecture standing in the center of the Karnak. And these huge columns, 6,000 square feet, and the 338 feet depth and 170 foot wide Temple of Karnak was close to the Valley of Kings. This is Howard Carter. In order to use this particular picture, we had to get permission from Oxford and through the Griffin Institute. And they said, you can use 2 or 3 pictures from our archives as long as you will not sell the material for any more than the cost of printing. So I've got our lecture at the cost of printing, $10. I've got them on eBay for $20. But anyway, that's where it is. But in order to use some of these pictures for education, either you pay royalties or you sell it for the cost of getting it to the students. So today you're my students and you get student rates today. This was finding the inside of the Tut's tomb. This was Carter's journal, and this is actually the writing. This is the writing of Carter's journal. And in his journal, this is a translation of his writing. And here he says, on December 6th, I gave 4 pounds, January 1st, and 6 pounds, English pounds, total of 10 pounds, to the cook. He doesn't even name the guy by the name of C. Vincent Hall. He just, I gave to the cook. And so this was his particular record of keeping chart of the daily expenses. And then we run into here, 26 photos to Hall, Mena House, 2 photos of 20, 3 notes. To the cook, on account, 25 English pounds, plus today, total of 25 pounds. is see Vincent Hall ever mentioned in the journals of Carter. Couldn't find his name ever mentioned. Just paid to cook. And you almost say just to cook. You don't think cooks are important? People travel, even soldiers travel on their belly. My wife's dad was a mess sergeant in Anchorage, Alaska. And he had a lot of authority. That's why they made him a master sergeant usually, because they said, you eat your chow and don't give me a lot of trouble, private. And that's what happens. You know, cooks are pretty important, especially in military. This is another case we have in our search for. Let's see if we can get this thing. Here's the 1923 National Geographic, and in here is the cook's tent right here in the foreground, there by the head of the King Tut's particular tomb area. And they gave an exclusive to, I think, New York Times, and they wouldn't let other media in there. And because of that exclusive, they says, okay, we're just going to have to catch the fringes of the stories. And because the New York Times had such an exclusive, they paid for that exclusive, other media says, okay, we're going to talk about the curse of Tut's tomb. You're not going to give us the news, we're going to make the news. And so everybody ran crazy. And Lord Carnarvon ended up getting a mosquito bite. He cut it with his razor when he was shaving. It sepsis and infected, and he died, but he had a weak constitution. The curse of Tut's tomb. Carnarvon died because he was in Tut's tomb. But Carter was in there. He lived for years and years and years and years, 20, 25, 30 years after that. And his wife was in there, and she lived for years and years. And I'm sure Vincent Hall was there, and he lived for probably another 20, 25 years. And all these ideas of curses sold magazines and newspapers and sold movies, but it was a lot of hype of the era. This is interesting here. In one of these pictures, they would set up a cafeteria and eat in another tomb. And here we have Carter and Lacal and others at the laboratory, the tomb of Sethos. And this is the tomb. And seated from right to left, they had Breestead and Harry Burton. He were part of the scientists he had on his, photographers and preservers. Lucas, Arthur Calendar, Arthur Mace, Howard Carter, A.H. Gardner. And you see this chair here? They say, well, they think that was Lord Carnarvon's chair. Or it could have been C. Vincent Hall's chair. We don't know. And this is my frustration when you try to find, why in the world can't we find this guy recorded? Was he not that important? And this was coming down the steps of the tomb, going in through and into the burial chambers of, and this was finally broken into, and they couldn't break the seal until they had special permission. You found a tomb intact, you had to get other permits, and that was part of the time. This was the interesting story here, another interesting picture. They would stay at Mena House, and they'd ride on mule or horse back and forth to the dig site. This was during the time of the discovery of Tut's tomb. And it says here that left to right you got Arthur Mace, Arthur Calendar, Howard Carter, and an unidentified man. An unidentified man. This guy right here. And the face and all. You don't know. Is this C. Vincent Hall? It says down here, photographer, not known. Now, my question was, is this Vincent Hall riding the horse, the unidentified man, or was he the photographer taking the pictures? And we do have evidence he took a lot of pictures himself. And if you are the photographer, you're never in the picture. Unless you put it on a still time and you jump into the picture and click, smile, and then you get back behind your camera again for the next picture. And so some of my mystery is trying to find this guy even listed in the Carter journals and trying to find even a picture of him. And I couldn't find pictures. I mean, 23 years I finally found 2 pictures of the man. And that's doing some digging. And we had to go into a cemetery, and the cemetery was like 80 acres that had thornbriar 20 feet high. And the only thing was cleared was about 2 or 3 acres. I figured I'm going to have to take a machete knife and cut my way through to try to even find the man's grave. Because 1945 is when he was buried in Kingston, Jamaica at the Maypan Cemetery. And 45 is 55, 65, almost 70 4 years ago. Try to find a grave 74 years later. These are some of the fun. But this is how I know that this was Vincent Hall. New York Times, October 7th, 1923. It gives me this record, October 7th, the Reverend C. Vincent Hall, world traveler, lectured to the British troops of Egypt and Palestine, that fits the guy, got to be the guy, returned to America last week to begin a lecture tour. And guess what? He was here 6 months before Carter got to America. Vincent Hall, he goes on to say, was at the Luxor excavations of the tomb of Tutankhamun and took a large number of photographs. That's why he wasn't in the picture, which will be shown at his lectures. Mr. Hall served with the American Army in France. You notice, not the British Army, American Army in France among the Motor Transport Corps. I mean, this was a clue. You had to find a New York Times article to say, okay, that's your verification, that's your facts and information or so. Now, what he would do would use these lantern slides, and with these lantern slides, let's see if I even got some of those over here on the table somewhere. These are the particular lantern slides that he would use. I mean, they're not the little ones you're thinking of on 35, but these are the lantern slides, and they'd light this, it would produce a bright white light, and they'd slide these pictures through. Sometimes they'd hand color these pictures. Sometimes they'd have two projectors running at once, so they'd have a fade in, fade out. But these are the lantern slides. The 3¼ inch by 3¼ inch is the same size and type of Henry Carter. So this is the size of the Carter slides, and these are on file at Oxford University among the Carter archives. Others are with the Carter family. And this was a little bit larger one, but this is the size that they kept in their presentation. And he'd go around, and for 10 cents for a child and 25 cents for an adult, they'd come to these lectures. A peek into Tut's tomb among the Australian Aborigine. I walked where Jesus walked in Galilee, you know, and all these other lectures they would have back in that day. You know what eclipsed the lectures of that day? The movies. Whenever they ended up with the black and whites, and then they came in with the talkies, and later on it just eclipsed all this. But in the late 1800s, early 1900s, traveling lectures with magic lantern slides was common. And we find that Lieutenant C. Vincent Hall covered a lot of that, his lectures, and did a lot of lecturing at that time. These are some of his pictures among the Aborigine. And this was like 1910, when he was in Australia. In 1910, for you to go to the cabarets of the Australian Aborigine as a white man, you just didn't go to an Australian Aborigine cabaret. You're not invited. Hall was invited. He had respect among the Australian Aborigines, like Crocodile Dundee. Mr. Hall, why don't you come join us for our celebration? So he had that respect. He talked in some of his lectures how in Torres Straits there in Australia, this pearl diver got his head caught in a shark's mouth and lived to tell about it. Wouldn't that be an exciting lecture? Now, in his discussions, we have some of the most venomous snakes in Jamaica. Not in Jamaica, in Australia. And he knew about all this flora and fauna. And in these particular snakes, there's a snake that's so much, you know, you get bit by a cobra, you got 20 minutes to die. You got bit by an Australian, some of the Australian breeds of snakes. You sit down, this little snake this big bites you on the buttocks, and you say, I think I was bit by a snake, and you're dead. I mean, instantaneous, you're dead. That's how deadly poisonous these are. Yet only about 2 or 3 people die every year from snake bite in Australia. Probably more people get run over by drunk drivers than get bit by snakes. But other than that, these are some of the pearl diver, and some were actually after pearl, and some would be after the pearl shell, where they make buttons and design with the pearl shell. And of course, we had to add our shark in here just for fun, just to add a little glamour to the discussion here. But a lot of these guys are free divers. Others would have the big, heavy tank and the big, 80-pound boots. and they go down with their hose, and that's how some of them did their diving. This is some of the other flora and fauna of Australia. One of the most interesting things was this particular Ayers Rock. Ayers Rock is located on over in South Australia. This rock, depending on how the sun is shining on it, it's a sacred place to the Aborigine. It's a meteorite that crashed to the earth. And you've got a blank, flat area for as far as miles can see, and then you have this mountain that was a meteorite that landed. And it's got the same respect there in Ephesus. If you remember the Temple of Diana in a former lecture, there's a meteorite that landed there, and that became a sacred place where people worship Diana the Ephesians. If you remember, if we go out there to Wyoming, and you got the Devil's Tower, that's a sacred place to the Indians, and the Indians from all over the Southwest come to Wyoming to annually and periodically for their sacredness to these particular sites. And so they had certain significance in that particular. Here's one of the cabarets that our Crocodile Dundee Vince Hall was there. That's going into the lantern slides. Let me get on down. And I found a record of Mr. Hall when he was about 15 years old. His dad died. His mama married, I think, a Methodist preacher. And this preacher from the Disciples of Christ Christian Church moved in with them, and he was a circuit riding preacher, so he stayed with the Methodist preacher. And he would go preach among the Christian churches, Churches of Christ, living there in the manse of the parsonage. And C. Vincent Hall, as a young boy of 15 years old, would ride with a preacher on his circuit. And he had 4 churches, I found, that he preached among. And Vince Hall, for a couple of years, rode with a preacher on his route. And, you know, helped whatever a young kid could do, hand out the songbooks or pass communion or pass the collection plate. Can't forget that, of course. But back then, the cry was, we need the churches and people to donate $50 to buy a horse. And for $75, we can buy a saddle. So for $125, you can outfit a preacher to preach in Jamaica. Today, we need a van. Got to have a van. So that's how things have changed. They've changed, but they've not changed. This is one of the churches that Vincent Hall preached at. He came after he left the service, and after his expeditions and his adventures, even among the leper colonies on his way down to the Valley of the Kings, and going to Australia earlier, we found him, he sailed the globe, I think 3 times was recorded. And because of getting the phosgene gas from he breathed in, he'd get out the salt air and take these around the world cruises so he can breathe again and let the healing of the salt air clean out his lungs. And I've seen many times where he'd take a ship ride over to Texas and check himself into a veterans hospital because he was having a spell. And so I found some of his trails back and forth between Jamaica and coming to Texas. But this is the Brixton Hill Church. I visited this building probably 4 years ago. And said, this little church, about 50, 60 people meet there on a Sunday. It's a handsome church. It's a congregational church today. A union, more of a union congregational church today. But I said, have you ever heard of C. Vincent Hall? They never heard of him in their life. I mean, there arose a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. After you've got so many generations go, and 3 and 4 generations go by, who are you? And that's kind of an interesting picture we have. This is the Moko Church, which was there. He ended up with a fracas there with that church, and he had a falling out, and they said, well, you're not welcome to preach in this pulpit anymore. And I don't know if the discussion was over baptism, because some baptized by immersion, others baptized by sprinkling, whether that was the issue. But Hall was baptized like the Baptists baptized. And I don't know if they had a fracas over that particular doctrine. Well, I don't know. You just got to kind of fill in the gaps and wonder. But about 2 miles down the road, they built this little church building down here. And they said he had crowds of thousands. I don't know if it's a city square or not. But this little building will hold about 30, 35 people. And this was all wiped out. And in 2005, the AIDS, International Disaster Emergency Services, provided about $15,000 to our churches to rebuild a lot of the roofs. And one of our students from the college, the seminary, is the preacher here at this particular church. Since then, they've torn this whole building down, and they built a construction that'll seat about 300 people. The church isn't there, but to that attendance, but that's kind of where they are. This was the old building of Moco, and they started the seminary back in 1937. Then they recalled everybody because of World War II. All Americans go home. And they had this guy by the name of Schwartz came over to teach in the college in the 1951. The Jamaicans sent him home. You got to be a German spy. Your name's Schwartz. So they sent the man back home. Welcome to Jamaica. This is the Richmond Park. This was the second church. They call it Pastor Hall's Church. And we've had medical teams down here in Vacation Bible Schools. A small church, the mine's closed up, and the church is down about 15 people today, maybe 20 people. But this is one of his older churches. Here's Maca Tree. Our teams, work teams, went in, and this building will hold maybe 125 now. But here's the congregation of Maca Tree. It's interesting. Hall would go to the Baptist deacons and say, you need to become a Church of Christ. They make a profession, I believe, that Jesus Christ is the living God, and they welcome in. And the discussion, did they baptize them again? No, they just gave them a right hand of fellowship and welcomed in. So I had a record where 11 Baptist churches became Churches of Christ upon a profession that Jesus was the Christ and a handshake. Now, don't tell your Southern Baptist preachers that, because they might get mad at me. But that's kind of interesting the way history goes, 1938. This is the problem. He started from this one church. He grew to 30 churches. He had personally baptized over 1,200 people. There are 40 preaching stations. He died in 1945. And in 1951, and 6 years after, came Hurricane Charlie, I believe it was. And it was such a devastating storm that about 6 or 7 of the churches of Christ he started were washed away. They were made out of stone and clay. And after the high winds and the high rain and all, the building just washed to the ground, just flat, level. And the preachers went to the congregation and said, shall we rebuild our church? Or should we go to England where there are jobs? Because England's rebuilding after the war. Because the war just ended 6 years later in England. There's lots of jobs in England. So you had huge migration. Jamaicans went to England. Churches. And we find that the Jamaican people and the Filipino people are the backbone of the evangelical churches in England. Which is kind of interesting that they become the backbone. They're the Sunday school teachers and the deacons and the whatever, as far as in the English church. But this 51 hurricane devastated and wiped out years of success, which is kind of interesting. Same thing happened in Panama whenever there's a huge Jamaican migration to build the Panama Canal. And many, by the tens of thousands, stayed in Panama. There's huge Jamaican dwelling there, just like in Jamaica, New York. Huge Jamaica migration. Today, a lot of Jamaicans are migrating to Canada. All the trade, the electricians, the concrete, block layers. Canada's crying for the skills of the Jamaican. You can't find too many young guys today that want to lay cement block. And the old guys that used to lay cement block, they're either retired or dead. And so they bring the Jamaicans into Canada to do a lot of the work, to do the skill of that particular area. But this is what happened. This is the seminary that we're president of, 1956, 1957. Some of the students that were there and some of the American professors. It was sponsored by Ozark Christian College in Joplin, Missouri. Their professors would come down and teach and work with the Jamaican churches. This is some of the pictures of the seminary. Some there, and in Grand Cayman was a sister outreach. This building is the one built in Kingston, Constant Springs, and the building from here on down has been all raised in a new church building that seats 300 people. They're sitting here. This stood as of 2006, and this was the old seminary building. This is where they tore it down and added the church building. And we, for the college, were just using a small room that would seat right in here. Right in here was a small room. Whoops, let me get back here. Come on. Come on. Where are you?
You're going backwards.
Okay. This, I got to aim it over here, it don't work here. But we were just using this small room right in here, put in an air conditioner, yes, because it's hot in Jamaica. And this was our classroom. It seated about 18, 20 students. It was not a big classroom, but that was our class. Later on, we moved to Mandeville and over to Mineral Heights, and in the next few years we're going to move it back to Kingston. We're doing some renovation there. Vincent Hall was an evangelist. He invited a preacher from Los Angeles, California to come down and be his administrator for the college. And so they worked together. He did the evangelist, so planting the churches. The other man partnered with him, and they were training the local preachers and Sunday school teachers. And that guy's name was Luke Elliott. And he was so fiery and involved that a witch doctor provided poisonberry to assassinate him. They tried to kill the man through arsenic poisoning. And after 11 years he left with a broken health and went back to Los Angeles. But that was one of the first presidents of Jamaica Bible Seminary. A lot of tales. That's probably another story for another time. This was the Christian church in Jamaica, where Hall had a huge revival meeting. And in that revival meeting, he converted the leadership of the church. They didn't even know Christ. It was such a liberal church. And he had a tremendous revival meeting in that old church in that particular time. Okay, this is me and my wife. You know us. Come on. This is a Greek class we had back in 2006. Dick Ellis, this is an interesting story on Dick Ellis. When I was 17 years old, he was my college professor in Ottumwa, Iowa. And he had his huge assignments. We had to sit down and write verbatim 9 pages of information on the 72 places that Christ went and 256 subpoints word for word on the entire travels from the birth, life, death of Christ. Here it is in 2006. I said, Dick, I want you to come down to Jamaica and teach for me. And it's neat for me to be able, as a kid, hand the old professor his teaching assignment. That's really neat when you get to do that. This was our graduation. We had this last June. We had 14 graduates. And these were some of our graduates that were there. You notice my wife and Winston Scott at the very end. My wife got her master's. Winston received an honorary Doctor of Letters degree. This is the seminary currently. We're meeting the upstairs. It used to be a parsonage of this facility. This building will hold about 300. This is a 2-story building, about 1,800 square feet we use currently. There's a 3-story building beside this. And over in the back, there's another 5,200 square foot first floor. My wife started this school with 17 children 20 years ago. And she taught 2 teachers and 1 principal. The Grove Park Christian Church allocated $2,800 from their mission department to buy the materials to get this school started. 20 years go by. 400 students, 52 staff. They go through 5th grade now, and they're adding 6th in 2020, 2021. It's incredible. It's the best school in the district. It's the 3rd best school in the entire nation. This little lady did it all. With a lot of help. C. Vincent Hall dies February 26, 1945. He's buried in the Maypen Cemetery, Ebenezer Cemetery in Kingston. He was always a highly respected man of God. And in this, we had, let me see if I can get to here. These are some of the latter pictures. I had to have a PS to this display. And part of the PS, in 1953, remember he died in 1945. He's buried in Ebenezer Cemetery. 7 years later, in 1953, there were 45 congregations were reported with 30 mission preaching points with a membership of approximately 3,000 people. So this was part of his work as an evangelist, starting with 1 church, going to 45 churches in about 10 years' time, which was incredible, in spite of the 1951 hurricane that wiped a lot of things out. This is some of the modern shots of King Tut's tomb. This is in the last couple years. They moved King Tut back out of the Egyptian Museum and put him back in the Valley of Kings. They put the old man back where he belonged, the young man back in his grave. He says, why let them rest in peace. Quit digging them up and putting them on display, you know, as far as in a museum. Put him back in his grave where he's supposed to be. And so they did. And this is some of the modern shots, just to bring up to speed of the rest of the story with. Here's some of the restoration of some of the paintings there in that particular tomb. Here's a 9-year conservation project. This is completed by February 2019. So this is recent. And this is, of course, King Tut. And this is Howie Zawasawai. He's the guy on the History Channel, anyway, that they always talk to this guy. He's on History Channel quite a bit as far as the eminent archaeologist and director of archaeology there in Egypt. This is the tomb. He's in a glass case, preserved and on display. He's not necessarily in his gold sarcophagus. Here's a close-up of Howard Carter right after they pulled the lid off. And this is some of the inside, full color. Here we go, come on. This is Maypen Cemetery. We went to this Maypen Cemetery trying to find Vincent Hall's grave. And I found out the guy that was the curator of the grave said, oh, he's not buried here. And I thought we were going to have to chop through 80 acres of thorn bush that's 20 feet high to find his grave. Oh, no, he's buried down here at Little Church Cemetery 2-3 miles down the road. So we go down 2-3 miles down the road. And it's interesting, here's a lecture pointing to the tomb of King Tut. And here is the curator pointing to the grave of C. Vincent Hall, we think. There are only about 50 graves in this Little Church Cemetery. The only thing is they had these marble stone that were up so high, and the people would snap them off and carve little donkeys out of them and little whatevers out of them and sell them at the craft market to the tourists. So they'd go into local cemeteries, steal the marble, so they could chip it up and make little donkeys to sell. And so when we went into the cemetery trying to find it, when I got to the cemetery and saw I'm not going to have to chop through all this thorn briar to find it. And another problem I had, some of my students are police officers. I said, I want you to accompany me to go into and look for this cemetery. My police officer students refused. He says, it's not safe. It's not safe for us, it's not safe for you. Just about the time we go in there, the drug lords are going to shoot at us, we're going to shoot back. This is the time of Dudas when he was extradited and brought back to America. And this is the time they had 72 people shot up between the gangs fighting with the Jamaican militia, and they had the bodies all stacked up there. And we came in 2 weeks later, told the wife, I said, don't worry about a thing, we won't even be even close to it. And when Preacher Ronnie picked me up, here we go, he says, hey, Brother Richard, you see out there? That's where those bodies were stacked up, right over there. You know, I says, oh, and my wife was all worried about me being out of that area anyway. But the reason the curator pointed to these graves with the brick, he died in 1945, and the modern Jamaica graves are usually concrete cinder block and concrete pour. To go into the red brick gives us a date of the 1940s, 1950s. So they say this gives us an era. Is this C. Vincent Hall's grave? I don't know. It's the right cemetery. It's the right construction as far as brick. But to say, this is the place, this is my frustration, Miss Kathy. You think you finally found it, and you didn't. In the selling compass, this book, he was for a while when he was out of the ministry, he was a salesman, and he wrote the selling compass. And in this particular book, it was from selling tips. And here's the second picture I had of Mr. Hall. And it talked about he had circled the world so many times and had been with Allenby as his lecturer and so on and so forth. This book was written in 1929, 1931. And I want to leave you with this. History will not be concerned about how long you live, but it will be tremendously concerned about your achievements. 50 years from now, 1981, half of the people who are living today will be dead, forgotten. 100 years from now, all of us will be dead, and 95% of us will be forgotten. And he, Vincent Hall, lies in an unmarked grave, April 12th, 2019. Wow. This is Ronnie, a preacher friend of mine that was a driver and the caretaker. He's over all the Jamaica cemeteries. And this is the Maypen churchyard. And Hall, we think, is buried behind, clean on behind this particular facility. Walk through the gate and around and back, over and back behind the church building is where we think. And there's cemetery on all three sides of this particular church building. Let's see where we be. And Miss Kathy, that's where we end our lecture. Any questions? Any questions? Any answers?
I noticed that the Australians in the first picture were riding camels.
Yeah, they were the camel crew. They used horses and camels in, like, Lawrence of Arabia, leading the camel soldiers. And it was not, they brought camels over to America to try to open up the desert for the Pony Express. They're going to use camels to run the Pony Express. And then you will replace that. The railroad ended up with a postal contract. And then when the post office lost the railroad contract, everything became airmail after that.
The Australians have been trained in the middle of Africa, the British.
But if you notice, they were doing their boot camp training in Tripoli, Africa.
Yeah.
And as they did their boot, they in Tripoli, Africa, and then they shipped them out from there into Israel, Palestine. So they shipped them over by boat into the...
There was just a report a little while ago of a city in Australia that was overrun by camels that were taken to Australia to try and deal with the outback, and when it didn't work out, they turned them loose, and it turns out they're an invasive species.
It's kind of like the horses in North Carolina, the wild horses in North Carolina, out west, that were, and even the horses were not native. The Spanish brought the horses over to America, same situation.
The camels they imported to the southwest, like Arizona, in the 1860s, were still being reported as late as the 1950s. They seem to be gone by now. We haven't seen one for 50, 60 years, but they lasted quite a long time.
Yes, they did. Yes, they did.
Doc, I have a question about the Church of Christ.
Yes, sir.
There's the United Church of Christ, and then there's the Church of Christ.
Yes.
And
no connection.
Yeah, and I was wondering which connection it is with this.
Okay, the United Church of Christ was actually part of the unity movement in the the 1930s, 40s, 50s. You had the Disciples of Christ, Congregational, Presbyterian, Methodist. I remember preaching in a Methodist church in Pennsylvania. They were united, the Brethren and the Methodists united. And you'll find among the churches of Christ, they are non-denominational. Some are anti-denomination. They go to the other extreme. Some will say we're non-denominational, others say they're anti. But the churches of Christ, back in the days of Alexander Campbell, Barton Stone, the Kentucky Revival up in that area, King Ridge, was a great awakening, second great awakening in America. And we even had a member of the President Garfield was a member of the Churches of Christ, Christian churches. And this religious movement split up about three different directions. You had the Disciples of Christ, which they call the more liberal, and they do ordain, marry homosexual, and ordain homosexual. You have the Christian church, independent Christian church. You got guys like Bob Russell, congregation about 19,000 up in Kentucky. It's one of the largest churches in America. And it's a conservative congregation, but love God, love people, and it's just an outreach kind of a congregation. You got guys like that. And then you've got what they call the more of the legalists, the non-instrumental churches of Christ, who are against music. Sometimes you've got one cup. Some of them are against Sunday school classrooms, against eating in the church building, and this, that, and the other thing. And so some churches are what they're against, some churches are what they're for, and you've got that whatever. But Civil War divided a lot, the North and the South, and you've had a lot of the Southern churches, they were against going to war. You had a lot of Northern churches, like guys like President Garfield. He was with General Grant, the military leader. And Garfield, as president, didn't know that. James Garfield, even though he was assassinated, was an evangelist on the level of Billy Graham before he went into the presidency. And he would have church in the Capitol Rotunda. And somebody came up to President Garfield and says, Mr. Garfield, we have to have a meeting on Sunday. Important cabinet meeting. And President Garfield says, can't. He says, why? What's so important? He says, I have a previous appointment. Well, what appointment do you have so important that this national crisis is going to, not preempt it? He says, I have an appointment with my Lord at the Lord's table every Sunday, and I will not meet that appointment. And he was an elder in the Christian church, James Garfield, for president. And the interesting thing with that is that national emergency, who even knows what it is right now? Probably dissipated and ran itself. But Mr. Garfield was in church Sunday, serving at the table as an elder in his church. Anyway, but to answer your question, the United Church of Christ is all part of the United Koku Consultation Church Unity and all that other. And they tend to be the more progressive churches. And the others are the more conservative churches. And so there's...
So this is the church you're talking about?
This is, I'm going to say, Christian Church, Church of Christ Instrumental. It was among the other. I know Hall was ordained by a Church of Christ in Texas. A Baptist church donated a 2,800-pound bell over to that Moco church, and the clapper's stolen, but the bell's still sitting there, and my goal is to get that bell to ring again and put a memorial plaque on memory of buried at Maypen Cemetery. Because we put another headstone out there in that little cemetery, some of the crap aren't going to steal our headstone again. So over in the churchyard, I'm thinking, which is probably 50 miles away, 60 miles away, we'll probably put a memorial there when we restore the bell to his memory. Because right now he's got an unmarked grave. Yes, sir.
Did I miss, where was Paul born?
In Jamaica.
In Jamaica?
In Jamaica, yeah.
So he was presumably wearing Jamaican colors when he was breveted up?
No, when his daddy died, when his mother died, he lost his faith. He backslid. He lost his faith, went to America. And when he came to America, we find him married and divorced. And I found where he's applying for a lay ministry position with an Anglican Church of England. And he's going in as a minister in the Church of England. And the next thing you know, he's got a passport heading to South America. And it says, C. Vincent Hall, divorced. And then I go digging through the files and I find C. Vincent Hall, and I find his marriage certificate. I got a copy of it buried here. Find his marriage certificate where he married a college professor of chemistry at Iowa State University. And her name was Ethel Rawlings. And she inherited a ranch in Texas. And she'd run her ranch in Texas while he was doing his preaching down in Jamaica. I don't know how well that worked out, but this was his second wife. But they'd get together and she'd go on his lectures with him, and he'd tour America and raise up money for Jamaica needs, and that was kind of what he did. But it's a hunt. Any more questions? There's a display here to go through, and if you want to be privileged to get a book and read the rest of the story, thank you.